Welcome. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of Fall's Monadrisha. Welcome to the fifth session of Exodus Marching to Sinai with Rabbi David Silber. This is a continuation of Rabbi Silber's ongoing Sunday series covering the first two books of Tanakh, looking at as the narrative approaches the revelation at Sinai. Rabbi Silber is the dean and founder of Drisha. Classic sources for today will be coming from your own preferred Tanakh, if you have one, and I will also be sharing things on screen from Sefaria as Rabbi Silber is quoting them. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. All right, we're in the middle of the story of the Mun, chapter 16 of Sefer Shemot. We started last week. We picked up on several key points in the story of the Mun and its place within the book of Shemot. I wanted to actually continue with primarily with one more fundamental theme or fundamental point about the presentation of the Mun in chapter 16. Just to recall, chapter 16 is pretty much in the middle of the book. It's the first big story after the people crossed the sea. We preceded by Mara, but this is the main story, the first big story. And it's a story that appears not only here in chapter 16 of Sefer Shemot, but there's a sequel to the story, and we'll see this later this morning in chapter 11 of the book of Bamidbar. And finally, this reference to the Mun in the Torah in chapter 8 of Sefer Devarim. So I want to take a look at the presentations of the Mun in those three places, in particularly the one in Sefer Devarim, which is very striking. We'll get to that. But before that, the main point I wanted to make about the Mun and its relationship to the rest of this book, Sefer Shemot, is the following. In the chapter 16, the Torah describes how the people gather the Mun. That's chapter 16 in the 21st pasuk. Vayikutu oto baboker ish kafi ochlo b'cham hashemesh v'namas. So they would gather it baboker in the morning. The double baboker is interesting. Baboker. Get back to that. And when the sun would come out, it would melt. They had to gather it before it melted. Exactly what time in the morning is not clear, but at some point in the desert, when it gets very hot, the Mun was not able to be collected. Then the Torah continues, Vahi bayom hashlishi l'aktu lechem mishneh. Shnei ha'omer la'echad. On the sixth day, they would gather a double portion, twice the amount they gathered the other days. Vayavo kol nisiyehu ha'edah vayagidu l'Moshe. And the heads of the congregation, chieftains of the congregation, they apparently didn't know about this. They didn't realize that on the sixth day, they would be gathering a double portion, which is actually very strange, because earlier in the chapter, let's find that verse. Yes, it's right in the beginning of the chapter. It's verses number 4 and 5. Vayomer Hashem o Moshe, in verse number 4. That's where God says, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven or food from heaven. They would go every day they collect it. In order that I test them. We spoke about that last week. What is the test, etc. In verse number 5, but on the sixth day, they shall prepare. They shall prepare on the sixth day for the next day. It shall be a mishneh, double portion, twice as much as they collect yom yom. So they collect yom yom every day. But on Yom HaShishi, they collect mishneh yom yom, the double portion. Moshe was told that in verse number 5. Now, we are told in verses 21, 22, that's exactly what they did. They would collect it every morning, right? Even earlier, it says, By Yoketu in verse 17, I'll get back to that verse as well. In verse 17, they would go out, they would collect, and it turned out, what we'll discuss this in a minute. When they measured it, he who gathered much had no excess. He who had gathered little had no deficiency. They gathered as much as they needed to eat. Okay. And now on the sixth day, they get the double portion, as God had told Moshe in verse number 5. So in verse 22, but apparently, I don't know how else we can read this, the chieftains, the heads of the community, were not apprised of this. They had no idea. So they go to Moshe and they tell him what's going on over here. They're taking twice as much. What is this? And Moshe responds to them in the next pasuk, Vayomer Aleichem Hu Asher Diber Hashem. Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh, Lashem Machar. Tomorrow, Machar is Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh. One might say Shabbat, Shabbaton. Here we encounter this kind of term. Tomorrow is Shabbat, which is a Shabbaton. Eit asher tofu efu, eit asher tevashlu bashelu, v'et kol ha'odeif, hanichu lachem l'mishmeret ad haboker. So Moshe apprises them of what we assume they should have known. For whatever reason, they don't know. And Moshe says, no, this is what God told me, that on the sixth day, tomorrow is the Shabbat. It's Shabbat Shabbaton. It's a special day. Shabbat means you restrain, you rest. It's a day of rest, and therefore you're not going to go out on the seventh day to collect. Therefore, you have to collect for the seventh day on the sixth day. And therefore, says Moshe, I was told, whatever they bake, whatever they cook, they should cook, and the remainder they'll leave over for the next day. There's a disagreement between the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra and Rashi. Ramban agrees with Rashi, and I think the simple pshat is like the Rashi and the Ramban, namely, you cook for both days. You're cooking for both days. Some of what you cook, you're going to eat on the sixth day, and the rest and the remainder you leave over for the seventh day. Because remember, we were told earlier that they can't leave over. That was one of the two things that God had told Moshe. You can't leave it over for the next day. You have to collect the food every single day for that day. You're not allowed to leave it over. And we're told earlier in verse number 20, V'lo shamu Moshe. Moshe says in verse 19, V'yomer Moshe alehem, ish ayotem mimenu ad boker. Nobody should leave it to the next morning. You have to, the food that you collect, you eat on that day. V'lo shamu Moshe. But they did not obey. They did not listen to Moshe. Vayotiru anoshim mimenu ad boker. Some people, anybody, left it over till the next morning. Vayorum tolaim vayivash. It got spoiled though. Vayitzof alehem Moshe. Because Moshe had told them, upon God's directive, you can't leave it over to the next day. So there's a connection between the man on one hand and Shabbat on the other. The idea of preparing for Shabbat, this whole concept of cooking for Shabbat before Shabbat, and not on Shabbat, this is the source. The man is the source for the idea of preparing for Shabbat, which of course is one of the central ideas in terms of Chazal, in terms of Shabbat. The whole idea, for example, of muktzah, not moving around certain things. The idea is that everything has to be prepared for Shabbat, either explicitly or implicitly. All food is implicitly prepared. But things that are not food are not things that we use, ochlim and kelim, those things you can't move on Shabbat. They have to be prepared for Shabbat, and this is the source of that. But actually, what I wanted to begin with, and we'll come back to this point as well about Shabbat, but I wanted to come back to the end of verse number 23. Vayomer aleichem Moshe hu asher diber Hashem, Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh Lashem Machar, eit asher tofu efu, eit asher tevashlu bashelu. Where focus to bake and vashelu is to cook. And kol ha'odeif, whatever remains, hanichu lachem l'mishmeret ad haboker. Leave it, keep it, put it aside to be kept. Mishmeret, from the word lishmar, to watch. Ad haboker. Here we encounter an interesting word that will appear later in this chapter. and that is the word mishmeret. In verse number 23, it's to be left over as a mishmeret, something to be watched. And this leads me to what is the central idea of this morning's session, which is the connection between the mon on one hand and sacrifice on the other, korban on the other, and specifically, primarily sacrifices as they emerge from a reading of this book, of Sefer Shemot. Let's begin with the word mishmeret. The word mishmeret appears in the Torah several times. It appears in the Tanakh at some additional times as well. But the word mishmeret in the Torah typically, almost perhaps exclusively, is connected to either the temple, either the Mishkan, or to sacrifices. Let's give a few examples. One example is from something that we have already encountered earlier in the book, and that's back in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is the chapter which deals with the Korban Pesach, and with the first main mitzvah that the Jewish people are commanded. And I'll just read it to you. We're all familiar with chapter 12, but chapter 12, the Korban Pesach, one of the unique features of Korban Pesach is that the Torah says that you actually set it aside earlier. The Korban Pesach is brought on the 14th day of the month, or it's the first month, the month of Nisan. But you actually are to take the Korban Pesach, the Torah says, on the 10th day. On the 10th day, you shall take for yourself a lamb for the household. If there aren't enough people, you join with the other household. And the Torah says, it shall be a mishmeret. You watch over it. That's the first time we encounter the word mishmeret. It's in terms of the Korban Pesach. And this is true in general in the Torah. The word mishmeret, something that you watch or guard, refers to something which is sacred, and typically it refers to sacrifice, either the Mishkan or sacrifice. The families of the Leviim all have a mishmeret. They have a task. They also guard. They watch over the temple. They watch over the Mishkan. So in other words, the idea of the mon being a mishmeret, and this is found in our verse, in verse number 23, but actually it appears later in the chapter as well. Later in the chapter, Moshe, and this is verse number 32 of our chapter. Vayomer Moshe, Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem, melo ha'omer mimenu lemishmeret v'dorotechem. L'man yuet halechem asher echalti etchem b'midbar v'yotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. So Moshe says, fill up, take an omer. Omer is a measure. Let one omer be kept throughout the ages, a mishmeret, in order they may see the bread that I fed you in the wilderness when you brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's in the 32nd pasuk. In pasuk 33, Moshe tells to Aaron, "Vayomer Moshe el Aaron, kach tzintzenet achat, v'ten shama meloho memon, v'anach oto lifnei Hashem, v'mishmeret l'dorotechem." In fact, Moshe commands Aaron, take tzintzet, some kind of a jar, and fill it up with an omer, that it be a mishmeret. And then in pasuk lamed dalet, in the next verse 34, kasher tziva Hashem et el Moshe, v'yanicheu Aaron lifnei ha'edut l'mishmeret. In fact, Aaron did set it aside as a mishmeret. So in 3 consecutive verses, as we come to the conclusion of chapter 16, the mon is a mishmeret, and it's a mishmeret not just to keep it for the next day, but it's a mishmeret for all time. It's something to be preserved something to be, it's like in a museum piece. You can see this. Whoever sees it will remember that in the desert, we were fed by this man, by the man, and this is a mishmeret. In other words, there's something about the man, right? God's lechem. Remember that God's lechem is a term that is used in the Chumash for sacrifice. And karbani lachmi leishai tishmeru. That's the wonderful pasuk for us. The first pasuk about the carbon tamid, which is brought in the morning and the evening, right? The carbon tamid, the daily sacrifice, which is morning and afternoon, boker and bein ha'arbayim, right? And the pasuk is, Tzav, God commands, Tzav et b'nei Yisrael v'martalehem, et karbani lachmi leishai, reach nichochi tishmeru, la'akriv li b'moado. There you have it, right there. You have the carbon tamid, which is called God's lechem. The man is God's lechem. Right? God is bringing down the lechem, God's lechem, and it rains down every day. It's like the carbon tamid. And it's a mishmeret. And the Torah tells about the carbon tamid, tishmeru la'akrivi b'moado. And I would add that in this chapter, and we'll discuss this a bit later, Moshe says to the people, we saw this last week, when the people complain they have no food, they actually complain they have no meat and they have no lechem. And Moshe says, listen, God's going to bring you food, ba'erev tochu basar, uvaboker tisbu lechem. In other words, you have in this chapter also erev and boker, which is exactly what the Torah says about the carbon tamid. It's brought by boker, and it's a tamid shel boker, and a tamid shel bein ha'arbayim. So that's actually another interesting. The point is clear. I just wanted to point out how the Chumash, that the word mishmeret, is connected to sacrifice, as is the man. The sacrifice in the temple is brought every day. But in fact, the term baboker, we also encounter in terms of the service in the temple. I'll mention that later, exactly the sources. So right away, we begin to think about the man as some kind of a sacrifice. And I wanted just to point out some of the other connections between man on one hand and the sacrificial service on the other. I pointed out that the first time we ever have the word mishmeret is in terms of the carbon Pesach. The truth of the matter is, there's another link to the carbon Pesach as well. Well, what is that? What other restriction of the man applies to the carbon Pesach? It actually applies to all sacrifices, but it's singled out initially with the carbon Pesach.
But you can't leave over.
You can't leave it over. That is exactly what it is. That is known, right? The Torah says that the carbon Pesach is not to be left over till the morning. The carbon Pesach is eaten at night. We remember that from chapter 12. And you're not allowed to leave it over, anything over. It has to be fully eaten, which is perhaps one of the reasons you recall that in chapter 12, and I just read it before, that the Torah says that the family should acquire celebrate avot bayit. The bayit, members of the house, are together acquiring a animal for a lamb for the carbon Pesach. And the Torah says, what about if there aren't that many people in the family? Im yimat habayit miyot miseh. You have a small family, there's 3 people, whatever the number is, and you're not going to be able to eat a whole lamb. So something's going to be left over. So what does the Torah say in such a case? Then you join up with your next door neighbor. Why do you have to join up with your next door neighbor? And the answer is, of course, because next door neighbor, because if you have the carbon Pesach by yourself, you won't be able to eat it all, and some will be left over. And the Torah says you're not allowed to leave it over In rabbinic lingo, that is called the prohibition of notar, nun vav taf resh, notar, left over. Now, the truth of the matter is that prohibition of leaving over the sacrifice is not limited to the Korban Pesach, because later in the Chumash, the Torah generalizes this and says every sacrifice is this way. No sacrifice should be left over. If you did leave it over, then you have to burn it. That's the prohibition of notar. So it's a sacrificial prohibition. We've already encountered it in this book in terms of the Korban Pesach. And here we encounter it as well. The mon. Lo totiru imenu, don't leave it over. You're not allowed to leave the mon over. That right away gives it some kind of a sacrificial cast. I mean, what this is all about, more generally, we can talk about that in a few minutes, but I simply want to point out some of the connections between this chapter 16 and I would say Korban or Mishkan generally within this book. Again, highlighting the fact this is a story right in the center of the book, right in the middle of the book. Now, do we have any other connections to something that recalls temple sacrifice? Let's start with the book of Sefer Shemot. And there's one other thing that jumps right off the page, I think, which is actually very interesting. And that is that we have over here in chapter 16, in verse number 16, chapter 16, verse 16. Zeh davar asher tziva Hashem. Liktu mimenu ish lefi ochlo. Omer lagilgolet. Mispar nafshotechem ish lasher bi'alo tikachu. The command over here, Moshe says to them, this is, first of all, he said in verse number 15, this is God's bread. Hu alechem asher natan Hashem lochem liyachal. This is God's lechem. And then in verse number 16, this is what God has commanded. Gather as much of it each day as you require to eat, an omer to a person, for as many of you as there are. Each of you shall fetch for those in his tent. And the Torah says, Vayasu Kain b'nei Yisrael, in the 17th pasuk, they did this. Vayokatu hamrabeh v'hamamit, they gathered. Some who gathered more, some gathered less, because it depends on the number of people in the family, in the household. So a big family gathers more, an omer per person, which is a lot, by the way, an omer per person. Vayomodu ba'omer. This is when they measured it. Lo hadif hamarbeh v'hamamit lo hechsir. Ish lefi ochlo lakatu. When they measured it, that's how it measured out. That exactly one omer for each person in the family. Now, how that could happen, I'll come to in a minute. But where else do we have this idea? In fact, a very similar verse in the book in Sefer Shemot. Lo hadif hamarbeh v'hamamit lo hechsir. Well, later on we're going to encounter this. That's the obligation that the Torah spells out in Parshat Kitisa, called Machatzit HaShekel. In building the Mishkan, so the Mishkan was built basically by people who volunteered the donations, all voluntary, except for one thing, except this thing called Machatzit HaShekel. Everyone was commanded to give a half shekel for the building of the Mishkan. Later on, that half shekel becomes not just building of the Mishkan, but it's understood to be also to purchase communal sacrifices. And the Torah said, when it comes to the half shekel, He'ashir lo yarbeh v'yadal lo yamit mimachatzit hashekel. When it comes to building the Mishkan, in this element of building the Mishkan, everybody participates equally. A rich person can't give more. You're not allowed to give more. And the poor person can't give less. You have to come up with a half shekel. Here we have precisely that. Lo hadif hamarbeh v'hamamit lo hechsir. There was for building the Mishkan. Here it's partaking of the mon. But once again, we have another link to Mishkan sacrifice. Now, by the way, just as a parenthetical, and I'll stop and take some, because there are several other connections to the idea of sacrifice I will get to. And this is actually very important, I think, for understanding a different description of a different story about the mud. I'll come to that in a few minutes. But how do we understand this idea? The way they measured it, it was exactly right. The person who had 10 people in the family, they had 10 omers. And the one who had 4 people, they had 4 omers. The one that had 2, they had 2 omers. How does that work? So here we have a very interesting debate, a dispute between Rashi and the Ibn Ezra. I always wonder about this Rashi and Ibn Ezra, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Rashi says it was a miracle. Whatever they gathered, those who gathered more, but when they counted it out, it wasn't more. Somehow it miraculously disappeared. And those who went out and didn't gather enough, when they counted it, miracle of miracles, they had exactly the amount of the Omer. That's what Rashi says. Now, as you can well imagine, the Ibn Ezra didn't go for that. The Ibn Ezra, together with the Rambam, the great rationalists, and they said that can't possibly. Ibn Ezra says it can't. Doesn't mean that. The pshat is something else, that it would spoil beyond that point. He says they gathered whatever they gathered. Of course, it doesn't really explain how the one who had less has enough. Hadaw, right? Could be that everybody gathered the amount they needed. Some gathered more than the amount, and that additional amount spoiled. If they took more than they were supposed to have, it spoiled. I think about this Ibn Ezra and Rashi very often because I wonder, I'm sure many of us who studied Chumash earlier in life probably were taught with Rashi. I mean, Chumash and Rashi. And I'm wondering, and Rashi has all kinds of midrashim. Rashi is very midrashic. I'm wondering if our approach to Chumash might have been different if we, instead of learning Rashi al Torah, we learned the Ibn Ezra al Torah, who tries to be quite rational. It tries to eliminate all the miracles and simply explain what it seems to say. And without the midrashim, the Ibn Ezra is not into the midrashim. So I'm just wondering in general, always wondered about that, how study of Chumash would look if instead of eliminate Rashi, at least at that point in our lives, we start with the Ibn Ezra. But anyway, here we have another connection to what we have later on about lo yarbev lo yamit. Another link between Mon and Mishkan sacrifice. Now there are others. So far we have the Mishmeret, and we have the lo yadif. We have the not leaving it over, which of course is central to sacrifice, notar. And there are several other connections as well. Let me mention one of them, which is fairly obvious, and that is that the Torah emphasized over here when it comes to the Mon, that each person was to take an Omer Lagu Golet. For each person, literally each head, was allotted one Omer. And the idea of an Omer actually appears later on at the end of the chapter. In fact, it's the last verse of chapter 16. The Torah tells us how much an Omer is. V'ya Omer asiri ta'efahu. An Omer is 1/10 of an ephah. The calculation of the ephah, the Gemara calculates the ephah. This is the last verse of chapter 16. There it is. Omer asiri ta'efahu. This actually is relevant for the following. An ephah, the measure of the ephah, there's a whole set of measurements, and it starts. Let's start with a beitza, an egg. So how many eggs is in an ephah? So I think there are about 430 plus eggs in an ephah. The omer is 1/10 of an ephah, and this is relevant actually. Does anybody know what this is relevant to from a practical matter? It's relevant to the mitzvah of taking challah. You have to take challah from the dough, but a certain amount of dough. How big must the dough be to obligate one to take challah? 43 plus eggs. And 43 plus eggs has to do with 1/10 of an ephah. An omer is 1/10 of an ephah, and it's relevant to taking challah. In any event, it's a lot actually. An omer be 43 eggs is a lot. So that's how much was allotted apparently for each person, which is quite substantial. But my point about the omer is we encounter the omer actually, asirita ephah. We encounter this in terms of sacrifice. In fact, you have it later on in the Chumash in terms of the sacrifice that I mentioned earlier, the daily sacrifice, the korban tamid, because together with the animal sacrifice is also called, we bring also a flour sacrifice called the mincha. And the Torah tells you how big the mincha has to be depending on the size of the animal. Asirit ha'ifah solet l'mincha. L'ra b'shemen katit revi'itahin. 1/10 of an ephah is one of the measurements for the mincha sacrifice. And not only that, we even also have a korban omer. We're all familiar with the omer. We count the omer on the 16th of Nisan, second day of Pesach, but the omer was the sacrifice that was brought on that day, the korban omer. So the omer is a sacrificial term, both in terms of having an actual omer sacrifice, and also in terms of the measurement. Omer asirito efahu is one of the measurements for the flour sacrifice that's brought together with the daily offering every day, twice a day. And once again, we have sacrifice, omer sacrifice, and specifically a flour sacrifice. Here in the case of the man, we have God's lechem. We have hu lechem asher natan Hashem lechem liyachla, and of course in the daily sacrifice, korbani lachmi liyishai. Another link between the man on one hand and the omer on the other. Now I have several other connections which I wanted to mention, but before I get to the others, let me stop here for a moment to take any comments or questions anybody may have over here.
I would like to highlight something from the chat from Susan Lieberman asking, I don't understand how Ibn Ezra explains it as not being a miracle.
Right, well, it's a miracle in the sense, right? It's in a sense that, I mean, in general, the man, when you keep it beyond this point, it spoils. Now that the Torah says explicitly. This food only lasts a certain amount of time. Of course, on Shabbat, it seems to last longer. It's not clear to me whether it's lasting longer for Shabbat because it's cooked beforehand, which is possible. One way to read it is when you're going to cook, if you leave it in its natural state, it spoils. But if you cook it on the 6th day or you bake it, then it can last longer. That's one possibility. But what the Ibn Ezra says is that the Ibn Ezra understands it to be just the nature of this particular food. It lasts only so much time. So if you took more, if you took more than that amount, you figure I'm gonna eat some now and I'll eat some maybe tomorrow or whatever happens. By the time night comes, it's already spoiled. That's what the Ibn Ezra suggests. My point is what he's moving away from is that miraculously, I took 3 pounds, and when I measure, it's only 2 pounds. What happened to the other pound? So that he doesn't like. That kind of a miracle, he says, that's not rational. It can't just disappear. So he says, oh, it doesn't disappear, it spoils. My point is really not, that's really a technicality for us over here. My point is that the approach of the Ibn Ezra is to the degree possible. He wants to explain everything as much as possible in rational terms. And that he's consistent throughout his commentary, totally consistent in this way. And my point was just to mention a reflection that I had many years ago. I wonder if we had been brought up with this. Everything has to make sense. Everything has to make logical sense. That's the starting point. And the Midrashim, okay, they say all kinds of things. We have to try to understand them from a logical standpoint, even as it would say, we can also reject them from a logical standpoint, but that I think for many of us, the way we approach the Chumash would be very different. But either way, that really wasn't my point. My point is that either way, this idea of having a specific amount for each day, that is something very central to the Mon. I'll come back to this later on. I mentioned this last week, that the term that is used over here, both the term baboker, which is the term that we find later in terms of, for example, the incense offering, is brought baboker. The Torah says later about the incense, which is brought daily, morning and afternoon. And the Torah says you do it every day, yom and boker. The same as the menorah. The menorah is lit at night and cleaned in the morning. Rambam taught you light it in the morning also, but the simple reading of the Chumash is you clean it in the morning, you light it at night, but every day is the same. It's done every single day, baboker, and yom vayom, and that's another theme of the Mon. I'm just pointing out all of the connections between the Mon on one hand and the Mishkan on the other, and then we can discuss what that might signify. But the point is just to point out all of these different connections, and there are more as well. And then we'll try to figure out what this actually all means.
Marcelo,
Yes.
This is a simple-minded question, but what was the consistency, what was the substance of the Mon? I always thought it was some kind of a pulpish thing, and I read here that it's cooked and it's baked. So what is its nature?
Well, what the nature of the Mon is a very excellent question. First of all, it's described one way in Sefer Shemot and slightly differently in Sefer Bamidbar. And the Midrashim, their Gemara there's a lengthy discussions in the Gemara about the Mon. What did it taste like? Because there's a section in the Psalm number 78, which I didn't mark down as one of the sources, but Psalm number 78 also describes the Mon in different terms. Lechem abirim. It's hard to know really. What the Gemara, I want to discuss this maybe a bit later, but the Gemara, later on in the Chumash, there's a complaint about the Mon, okay? In the book of Bamidbar, there's a complaint about the Mon. And the complaint seems to be, whatever it tastes like. The Torah here says, it tastes like tamo ketzapichit b'dvash. That's what the Gemara says. That's what the Torah says in chapter 16. Let's find it over here. Tamo ketzapichit b'dvash. Where's that verse?
How's the line start again?
The words are tamo ketzapichit b'dvash. It tastes like tzapichit b'dvash. Let me find that verse. Yeah, verse number 31. Chapter 16, verse 31. Vayikru b'nei Beit Yisrael et Shmo Mon, fu kezera gad lavan, v'tamo ketzapichit b'dvash. Okay, so the problem is, the house of Israel named it Mon, manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and it tasted like wafers in honey. They translate tzapichit, but the word tzapichit, as Rashi points out, and the Rashi only appears here in one place. It's the only time in the Bible the word tzapichit is here. So what does tzapichit mean? So wafers is basically, the Targum Onkelos says basically wafers or crackers. By the way, just as a parenthetical, the Tamok Tzapichit B'dvash is one of the few jokes that I heard from Rabbi Soloveitchik. He had the following joke about Tamok Tzapichit B'dvash. The joke was that the Rebbe comes to the class, the students are there, and they're reading the book of Shemot. They got to chapter 16, as we did, and one asked him, says, Rebbe, what does it mean, Tzapichit B'dvash? The Rebbe says, look, Moshe Rabbeinu took Israel out of Egypt, and they crossed the sea, and they came to the desert, and God gave them the man, and it was like Tzapichit B'dvash. So the kid says, okay, but what does Tzapichit B'dvash mean? Yaakov Avinu went down to Mitzrayim and we were enslaved there. And then Moshe Rabbeinu was sent to take us out. He took us out of Egypt. We crossed the sea, came to the desert, get mon, tastes like tzachbichis b'dvash. But Rebbe, but what does the word tzachbichis b'dvash mean? Avram Avinu was promised a covenant, and then Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim, and Moshe saves them, and it tasted like tzachbichis b'dvash. But what does it mean? Reshis bara lo kibet hashamayim v'yet haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and Avram and Yaakov, and tasted like tzachbichis b'dvash. So the kid says, what does it mean, tzachbichis b'dvash? What the Rebbe says? Are you denying Ma'aser Bereishis? Are you comforting Ma'aser Bereishis? The Rav liked that joke very much. I guess he liked it because when you don't have the answer, you say everything except the answer. The answer is, I don't know what tzachbichis b'dvash means, and you'd be in good company because it's a word that appears exactly one time. So we go with the translation here is based on Targum Onkelos, and Rashi says Ketargumo, so it's a wafer. So we know what it tastes like. It tastes like wafer and honey. The problem is that when you get to the book of Bamidbar and the other story of the man, it has a different taste. There in Bamidbar, which is chapter 11, that's where they complain about the man, chapter 11. There it says in chapter 11, verse number 7 of Bamidbar, V'yaman kisra gadhu, v'yeno kien habdolach, shatu am v'laktu v'tachnu borei chayim, l'dochu b'amdocha, b'shu b'parur, v'yasu oto ugot, v'yotamo kitam l'shad hashamen. So it says the man was kisra gad, and they translate coriander seed. In color, it was like bdellium. The truth of the matter is that it's the Rashbam already asked the question, maybe others, that coriander seeds are not white, but the color was. But the one is described as having a whitish color. But by the way, ein habedolach, the word bedolach is a word that we're familiar with. Bedolach was one of the gems that the priest wore on his coat when he did the service in the temple. It's another connection to the Mishkan. But the point is, over here it mentions that they would grind it up, right? Dochu bam docha. They would gather it in, they would grind it between millstones, press it in a mortar, and it tasted tamo kilishad hashamen. That's another problem. What does it mean in that you scroll down? What does it mean v'tamo kilishad hashamen? Right? People would gather it. It tasted like rich cream. You have to scroll down. Lishad hashamen. Here they translate rich cream. Lishad hashamen. So what did it taste like? Did it taste like rich cream, or did it taste like honey on a wafer? I'm assuming that rich cream and honey on the wafer are not identical. They're different tastes. There's a question. How do we resolve this? The medrash about the man is it tasted whatever taste you wanted. But the simple point over here about the man, whatever it tasted like, is that whatever it tasted like, okay, you could make it into cakes, we could grind it between millstones, etc. But fundamentally, you're eating the same food every single day. Yes, you could have a flight of imagination, it would taste differently, but it tasted the same. What bothers the people actually, in Bamidbar, chapter 11, they remember they had a real menu. You go to the restaurant, you got fish, you got cucumbers, you got melons, you got scallions, you got the works. That's what they remember from Egypt. And now every day we have the same food. I mean, variety is the spice of life, whatever it is, cream, rich cream, or whatever. Anyway, tzapichis b'dvash, so the Torah does tell us what it tastes like. But whatever it tastes like, presumably, it tastes pretty much the same every day. So here we have the man, and we have the Omer, of course. So this is the Omer, another link to the sacrifices. Okay, anybody else for any comment or question? Let me just make it. If not, let me just make a few other points about the connection to the to the sacrificial service, and then I want to get to the main point about this. Let me see. What else can we say about? I mentioned Baboker. I mentioned the Yom Vayom. I think that's most of them. Okay, there's some others that I'm not blocking on right now. There's a couple of other connections as well, but we mentioned 5 or 6 connections to the sacrificial service to the Mishnah.
Could I say something?
Yes.
So I think this is very interesting, the list of connections, but I'd like to think about a difference. That is, the Korban is our gift to God, and the man was God's gift to us. But on
Right.
Shabbat, it's different. That is, we give the Korban Tamid on Shabbat. It's very, and all of the Avodot of the Mishkan are carried out on Shabbat. But when it comes from God, it's encumbered with our having to observe Shabbat in the way that when it goes in the other direction, it's not. I'm not sure.
Right. That's a good question, but let me, since you mentioned that, I'm remembering another connection between the Mishkan and between the Mishkan and the Man, which is exactly your point. When it comes to the Mishkan, both in the instructions to build the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan, the Torah connects it to Shabbat.
Shabtotai Tishmoru.
Exactly. It sounds like you can build the Mishkan every day, but Shabbat you don't work.
Right.
Shabbat you don't work on building the Mishkan, and that's both true in chapter 31, V'shamru et Shabbat. It's equally true that before we actually start building it, in chapter 35, we're told straight out that we have to keep the Shabbat, that you're not allowed to light fires. Well, the Torah singled out lighting fires, I presume because fire is instrumental to making things, to building things. So you have, in the case of the Mishkan, the connection between Shabbat and Mishkan on one hand, and you have, in the case of the Man, both connections to the Mishkan, which are obvious, but also Shabbat. And not only do you have a connection to Shabbat, as I mentioned last week, when you learn Tractate Shabbat and say Eruvin, which are two big chapters, two big tractates, what stands out in Shabbos and Eruvin is that probably 80% of it is about 2 different malachot. One is carrying, the entire Eruvin is about that, all kinds of, and that's how Shabbat begins. And other chapters in Masechet Shabbat as well, and also cooking, lighting fires and cooking. Those are the two main topics in Tractate Shabbat. The 39 malachot are found in one chapter, and there's a couple of other chapters, but fundamentally, 80% or more is about carrying and about cooking. And exactly, these are the 2 parashiyot in the Chumash. The parashah of the Man, that's where we learn the laws about carrying. And the parsha in Vayakhel was about Lo Tuvaro Eish B'Yom HaShabbat. By the way, over here as well, Et Asher Tofu Efu, Et Asher Tuvashlu Bashelu, sounds like you're not allowed to cook on the Shabbos. You have to cook before Shabbos. So the Man becomes the source, really, of Tractate Shabbos. It's basically the story of the Man, and you have it with the Mishkan as well. That, of course, is another link between Man on one hand and Mishkan on the other. And I would say even beyond this, if you think about how the Chumash begins, the capstone of chapter 1 is the Shabbos, sacred time, and chapter 2 is about sacred space. It's about the Gan Eden. So the Man actually connects to both. The Man, as does the Mishkan, which is the culmination of the book. In other words, one way to look at this is to see that the Man is a kind of preparation for the Mishkan. The Man is the idea of the Mishkan, but in the very basic way we live. I mean, people have to eat in order to survive. If we don't have food, we don't survive. So on the basic level of simple survival, okay, the Torah is suggesting that it's not just about eating to survive. There's something about eating which can actually connect you to God, which can be spiritualized, which can be seen as a spiritual act. It's kind of preparation to the Mishkan. I think that the idea of Shulchan Mizbeach, that idea is something very central here in the Chumash. You're leaving Mitzrayim, and we're moving towards Sinai, moving towards the Mishkan. And as the first step towards that, we have to understand that the basics of life can also be sanctified. And the Torah then spells this out very clearly, that it's that it's about eating in a certain way, not eating at a certain time, not going out on the Shabbat, etc., etc. So all this is preparatory to the Mishkan. That's one thing about the man I wanted to mention. And then I did want to mention something else about the man, which maybe doesn't emerge that much from the text, but does emerge from, I think, rabbinic teachings, and maybe related to the Mishkan as well. And that is that the Gemara in Masechet Brachot, in Tractate Brachot, has an interesting debate about what the times of prayer. And the Gemara talks about, when the Gemara speaks about the times of prayer, let's say Shachrit, which you pray Baboker. How long can you daven Shachris? Can you pray Shachris only till, say, 4 hours, a third of the day? Or can you pray Shachris until half the day, till Chatzot? And the Gemara ties it with the Mon. Gemara says, how long would this idea, Baboker, the Mon, when did the Mon spoil? Did it spoil at midday? Or did it spoil after 4 hours, etc.? And the idea of connecting the Mon to prayer, which is found in several rabbinic statements that we can uncover, including the Talmud, it's actually very interesting. What did the Gemara understand? Why did the Gemara compare the Mon to prayer? And I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking that we have a standard prayer. We have the Shemona Esrei, pluses and minuses. You're saying the same prayer 3 times a day, and if you Chazor Sashatz twice more, 5 times a day. I mean, it's very problematic from that standpoint. But there's something else about the Shemona Esrei. The Shemona Esrei is actually telling us what we should want. What do we actually need? That's what the Shemona Esrei is about. What do you need to live in this world? You need insight. You need insight to know what you actually need. You need good health. You need to survive. You need a sustenance. You want to be in a place where you're secure, to kind of just a fair and just society, etc. Those are the things that we actually need. Okay, and the point of the Mon, I think one of the basic points of the Mon is that the Mon is God is giving us what we actually need. You need food, and you need it every day. And it's going to be provided every day. But you only need a certain amount. If you try to take more than you need, it's going to spoil. So the idea of prayer as focusing on what we need, requesting those things that we actually need. That's the idea of the Shemona Esrei. That's the idea of the Amidah. And that's the idea of the Mon. Maybe for this reason, the Gemara focuses on the Mon when it comes to prayer as well. Of course, prayer and temple, of course, themselves are connected. But my point is, the Mon becomes, in the rabbinic thinking, maybe because they see the connection to the Mishkan, it's a story which kind of directs us towards a kind of a way of living, not what we want, but actually what we need. So that, I think, is very important. And this idea of what you need as opposed to what you want, that comes through in the other story of the Mon. And that sort of reinforces what I'm suggesting about the connection to the Mishkan. And what I'm referring to is the story that appears in Bamidbar chapter 11. So let's take a look at Bamidbar chapter 11. And let's see what it says over there. Bamidbar chapter 11, stories in Bamidbar, of course, many
I didn't recognize you.
related to
5
the
more
stories that
minutes
we
with David
encountered
Silber.
in earlier in the Chumash.
Oh,
Chapter
you
11 is a chapter where things begin to go downhill. So it's chapter 11 begins with people complaining. Chapter 11, verse 1, the people complained. And that's a very unusual verse, chapter 11, verse 1, because it's the only time in the Chumash where the people are complaining, but we don't know what they're complaining about. The Chumash never says what they're complaining about. They commit onanim. They're complaining very bitterly, it says, before God. Fire breaks out, and it engulfs the edges of the camp, but it never says what the complaint is. It says they complained about something, the things are bad. How so? Torah doesn't say. God was very angry. Fine. That's the first pasuk, and then Moshe prays. In the second verse, the fire subdues, fire dies down, and the place is called Tavera. Tavera was related to fire. Kibar Rabam Eish Hashem. That's the first three verses. That's the introduction to now verse number 4, where we have the story of the man. So let's take a look at these few verses over here. And V'asafsuf Hashem b'kirbo kitavu tava. So the story, it begins with the asafsuf. This is in verse number 4, right? Verse number 4. The asafsuf, they translate the rabble. The word asafsuf is related to the word sof, to gather, maybe to the word sof, the edges. Remember, the previous story, the problems take place at the edge of the camp. So these are people that gathered to Israel. When Israel leaves Egypt, some of the Egyptians went with them. So the problem begins with the asafsuf, begins at the edges. Hitavu tava, they felt a craving. Here they translated gluttonous craving. Vayashuvu vayivku gam bnei Yisrael. Vayomru mi yachilenu basar. We're going to start with this now. I'm not sure we're going to finish this because it raises all kinds of interesting problems. But then the Israelites themselves, they also said, who will give us meat? Who will, if only we had meat to eat. And they continue. So we remember the fish that we ate in Egypt for nothing. We remember the cucumbers, the melons, leeks, onions, garlic. And now our gourds are shriveled up. All we have is the man. We're missing so much. The cucumbers, the watermelons, and all that. It's all missing. They remember fondly the food they had in Mitzrayim, which they got chinam, very striking. They got it for nothing. One asked the question, was it really for nothing? You were enslaved. Of course, they fed you, but you were slaves. Okay, leave that aside for now. And now the Torah, I mentioned this before, describes the man. Describes the man. V'yaman kisragaru v'enoki abdolach shatu am v'loktu v'tachnu b'reichayim tachu b'amdocha bishru b'parur v'asu oto ugot v'yotamo ketamu shadashamen. So here it's interesting that the Torah here emphasizes in our chapter in Shemot, it talks about going out and collecting it. Loktu d'var yom b'yomo. Here it's even more specific. Here it talks about what they would do when they got it. They would grind it, they would pound it, they would boil it, they'd make it into cakes, etc. So it requires more work. Maybe it's not chinam. The other stuff they were given was chinam. You give us food, we eat it. The cucumbers we eat, the fish we eat. Who prepared it? Maybe they prepared the fish. The watermelons, the leeks, etc. They're complaining. They don't like the man. They remember what they had in Mitzrayim. Part of it is there's a whole range of different foods. Here it's the same thing. Now the Torah says the man would fall. When the dew fell upon it at night, the man would fall upon it. Okay. Here there's a question. And again, Moshe hears the complaints. Moshe is very angry, extremely angry. And people are crying. And Moshe is Moshe's very, very upset. And Moshe turns to God, and Moshe says to God, in the continuation of the chapter, Moshe says to God, I'd like to submit my resignation. I'm not interested in this job. I can't take it anymore. Do me a favor. If you want to torture me, kill me yourself. Why? I want to see no more of my wretched state. The word Ra is the dominant word over here. Begins with Ra, it's Ra-T, etc. So God responds to Moshe. Moshe had two complaints. I can't do this job. I'm not cut out for this work. And how am I going to feed the people? People say the people want all this food. I have all these people. How am I going to feed them? So God responds in chapter 11 to both problems that Moshe has raised. We can't get into all of it now. There are two different questions, two problems that Moshe raises by his own work. He can't do it, he says himself. It's not possible. And then you got the other problem, how are you going to feed the people? So in terms of getting help, can't get into that for now. That's not our topic. God says, I'm going to provide you help. Fine. But now in terms of the food, V'yala'am tomar, this is verse number 18 of chapter 11. V'yala'am tomar, kitkadshu machar v'achaltem basar. Prepare yourself for tomorrow, you will eat meat. Ki b'chitem b'yoznei Hashem lemar, you cried in God's ears. Mi yachilenu basar, who's going to feed us meat? Ki tov lanu b'mitzrayim. You were better off in Egypt. V'natan Hashem lochem basar v'achaltem, but God will give you meat to eat. Lo yom echad tochlun v'lo yomayim. Not just for one day, not just for 2 days. Lo chamisha yamim, not just for 5 days. Lo asara yamim, not just for 10 days. Lo esrim yom, not just for 20 days. Ad chodesh yamim. Ad asher yetzei me'apchem v'yolachem l'zara. It'll come out of your nostrils. It'll become loathsome to you. You'll be sick of it. You have rejected God, Asher b'kirbechem, who is in your midst, b'kirbechem. And you cried and said, why did we leave Egypt? So God is very angry here. And God says, ma'astem, you have rejected God. We could talk about the word ma'astem, but not now. Ma'astem et Hashem, Asher b'kirbechem. The God who is b'kirbechem. Where do we have this idea of God being B'kir B'chem? Where does that come up in the Torah as a fundamental theme? The God who is B'kir B'chem. And that will come up later in our book. That's the story of the Mishkan.
Says that he wrote.
Shachanti b'tocham. That's the whole story of the golden calf. Ki lo ele B'kir B'cha. That's the whole dispute after the golden calf. Can God be B'kir Beinu? Moshe's request to God after Moshe prays to God. Yelechna Hashem b'kirbeinu, Hashem kilrachum v'chanun, and Moshe hurries up and prays. Imotzati chen b'einecha Hashem, Yelechna Hashem b'kirbeinu, come amongst us. That's the Mishkan. So God says over here, God is very angry. You have rejected the God who is b'kir b'chem. You have complained. They say, whine before God. Why did we leave Egypt? And here, there is, I think, an important key, which takes us back to this theme of the man and the Mishkan. Because God's statement to the people, not 1 day and not 2 days and not 5 days and not 10 days and not 20 days, 30 days. That God spells it out. That actually recalls a different set of verses, which I will read to you. And these are verses that are found in chapter 9, the end of chapter 9 of the book of Bamidbar. I'll just read you the verses. Chapter 9, verse number 15 in the book of Bamidbar. Uviyom hakim et hamishkan. Chapter 9, verse number 15. Uviyom hakim et hamishkan, ki sah ha'anon et hamishkan li'ol ha'idut. Uva'erev yiyah hamishkan k'marei eish ad boker. When the tabernacle, when the Mishkan was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the pact. In the evening, it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until morning. Ken tamid, it was always the same way. Hanan yichasenu umari yesh laila. Day and night, it was always the same. And then the Torah says, Ulufi he'olot ha'anan mi'ala obel v'acharei chen yisu b'nei Yisrael. When the cloud would rise above the tent, then Israel would travel in the desert. And when the cloud would rest, Israel would rest. Al pi Hashem yisu v'al pi Hashem yachanu. That's the way it always was. God determines when we move or when we stop. And now the Torah says in verse number 19, Uvarich ha'anon al hamishkan yomim rabim v'shamru b'nei Yisrael mishmeret Hashem lo yiso, our favorite word, mishmeret. If the Anan would stay for a long time, then Israel would stay. They would observe God's mandate and they would stay. Sometimes the cloud would be there for a few days. Al pi Hashem yachanu, v'al pi Hashem yisa'u. V'yesh asher yeh hanan me'erev ad boker. Sometimes the cloud was there just from the night till the morning. V'na'aleh hanan ba'boker, and they would travel in the morning. Or yomam v'layla, or day and night. V'na'aleh hanan v'nasol. And verse 22, O yomayim, O chodesh, O yomim, or 2 days, or a month, or many days. V'yarich hanan ha'mishkan l'shkon alav, yachanu b'nei Yisrael v'lo yisol. V'hei oto yisol. Al pi Hashem yachanu, v'al pi Hashem yisol. Et mishmeret Hashem shamaru. Al pi Hashem b'yad Moshe. Now, the cloud is lingering above what? What is this cloud lingering above? It's lingering above the Mishkan, lingers above the tabernacle. We notice, of course, you can't miss it, the parallels between how the Torah describes God's presence over the Mishkan in chapter 9, and that will determine when you move and when you stop. God makes those determinations. God guides you through the desert. Whenever God moves, you move. Whenever God stops, you stop. It's all about the Mishkan. And then in chapter 11, God is very angry. God says, you have rejected the God who is Bekir Bechem. This is the God of chapter 9, God of the Mishkan. I'll give you want meat, I'll give you meat. Not for 1 day, not for 2 days, not for 5 days, not for 10 days, not for 20 days. Notice it's quite parallel to what you have in chapter 9. In other words, the point is the rejection of the man in chapter 11 is the rejection of God in the Mishkan in chapter 9. That's the point, which fits in perfectly with everything we've seen so far. It's exactly the point. That's why God is so angry. I'm trying to teach you how we can live together and to have faith in God. Remember that the man requires faith because you can't keep it to the next day. There's no guarantee. When you have food day number 1, there's no guarantee you have food day number 2. It doesn't keep. So therefore, that for the Ramban was the test of the man. You live by faith because you have no guarantee that there'll be going where there's no food, and the only food is God's bread, and you can't keep it from one day to the next. But the point is, this theme of Mishkan and man, here's where it's very clear. Here's where the Torah spells it out about as clearly as one could spell it out. And that rejecting of the man, right, is rejecting of God's presence. In fact, rejecting of God's presence precisely described in terms of chapter 9, in terms of the Mishkan. So this fits in very nicely. And I presented it as the man is sort of preliminary to the Mishkan. The man is, it's a presence of God on the most basic level, on the basic level of you have to eat. You can't survive without food. And therefore you are dependent upon God's presence. This was the lesson of the man, and that's on all the connections and the linguistic links to the Mishkan now make perfect sense. I did want to mention one other thing, and then I'll stop. And we're running out. I'm not sure we're going to finish it now, but at least I'll raise a question for us, and then maybe next time we will discuss it. And that is but first of all, there's one question is the following. Let me put out one question without resolving it, and that is when you read Bamidbar chapter 11. People want meat. It sounds like they don't have any meat, right? That's what it sounds like. There's no meat. When you read our chapter 16, there it says that Moshe told the people, at nighttime you will know that God took you out of Egypt. In the daytime, you will see the glory, the kavod of Hashem. Chapter 16. And the Torah says, Vayih Erev, it came to pass at night, in our chapter, back to chapter 16, verse number 13. Vatal haslav, vatachas et hamachaneh. The slav, they translate quail, came and covered the camp. In the morning, you got the man. Now the question is, the commentaries are concerned about this slav, this quail. Do they get this every single night? In other words, are they eating every night they have meat and every morning they have man? Or was the quail just that one night? Or is the quail coming on occasion, but not every time? When you read the story in Sefer Bamidbar, it doesn't mention, it mentioned the quail as God will send the quail over, and there's so much quail that they can eat it for 30 days, etc. That's the story of Kivrot Tava. But you don't get the impression that they're having meat every night. If they have meat every night, what are they complaining about? We don't have meat. You do have meat. Every night there's meat. The morning is man and night is meat. There's lechem in the morning and basar in the erev. It certainly doesn't sound, when you read Bamidbar, that they have slav. So you have the slav mentioned over here, and the question is how to reconcile the apparent contradiction between Bamidbar on one hand and Sefer, in our chapter, Sefer Shemot on the other. The Ramban suggests that would have slav only on rare occasions. They would have meat on rare occasions, not as a regular staple. This is I simply raised the question, which it's an obvious question, but we raised the question here. I wanted to just conclude here with some psukim and Sefer Dvarim, and we'll talk about that next time. I'd like to hear what everybody thinks about this, something to think about. And that is that in Sefer Dvarim, in chapter 8 of Sefer Dvarim, there's a completely different picture of the man. The description of the man earlier is in Bamidbar was tamok shad hashaben, it's a rich cream. It's tapichas bidvash, it's a wafer in honey. Probably that's what the Targum said. Rabbi Soloveitchik's Rebbe didn't know, but the tapichas bidvash, a wafer in honey. In any event, yes, it's the same food every single day. You can tire of anything, but when you get to the book of Devarim, there we have a remarkable couple of psukim in Sefer Devarim. This is in chapter 8. I have to read the psukim and something to think about for next time. Chapter 8, it says, verse number 2 in chapter 8, Zacharta et kol haderech. You should remember the whole journey. Asher holichacha Hashem Elohecha zer 40 shana bamidbar. Remember the 40 years that God took you through the desert. L'man anotcha, l'nasotcha. God tested you. Anotcha. Inui is more than God presented hardships to test you. Ladat et Hashem b'lvavcha, to know what's in your heart. Hatishmar mitzvot lo. The desert is a test. Vayancha vayarivecha. Inui. He presented hardships. Vayarivecha. He starved you. Vayachilcha tamana shalo yadata. V'lo yadun avotecha. And God fed you with the man that you never heard of, nor did your ancestors. L'man hodiacha, to teach you. Ki lo al lechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. Human being does not live only on bread. Ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichyeh ha'adam. But from that what emerges from God's mouth can the person live. When you read these verses, vayancha vayarivecha, without getting into it now, we'll start with this next time. What does that mean? That certainly is a very different, it sounds like a different, depending how you read it. But one way to read it, and Chazal certainly did read it this way, that the man is actually vayancha vayarivecha. In other words, God tested you, God presented hardships with you, God gave you the man, is read by some as a definition of, an example of L'man anotcha vayancha. Inui, that the man is a kind of inui for the purpose of a test. So I want just to think about this, and for next time, what is the inui of the man? Why is the man considered inui? And we can talk about that next time.
Take care, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.